Good morning, everyone. This is one of our People Matter series, and we'll be looking today at the recent changes to the complex rules governing family-related leave. I'm Rebecca Cockerill. I'm a Principal Associate in the Employment team, and I'm joined today by my colleague Hatti Martin, who is an Associate in the team.
Hi everyone, good morning.
So just to start with a few housekeeping points. So there will be, we are recording the session today, so there will be a recording available afterwards. It will be circulated to you with just some follow-up, and in that actually will be details of myself and Hattie if you did want to link in. As we've seen, there is a Q&A box, so please do feel free to ask us questions during the session in the Q&A box. We won't be answering during the session just because of time, but we have left some time at the end to look at answering any questions you have. You can choose to be anonymous. Others won't see your Q&A question. So if you did want to use your name, then if we don't get a chance to answer the question today, we will look to try and follow up with you afterwards, but obviously you're entitled to stay anonymous if you wish. Also, at the end of the seminar, when you close it, there will be a feedback pop-up that will give you an option to give some feedback. That is really helpful to us if you can provide us with some feedback just to help us in terms of topics, format, anything like that. It just helps us frame how we run things moving forward. So if you can please give us some feedback, that would be much appreciated. So what are we looking at today? Well, first of all, we'll take a look at 3 changes that came into effect on 6th of April this year. So these are already in effect. We've had the legislation, we know all about them. The first is carers leave, so the introduction of 1-week carers leave and some changes on the horizon for that we'll take a look at. We'll then take a look at enhanced redundancy rights and the extension of the enhanced redundancy protection, which was previously just limited to those on maternity leave. Then we'll be taking a look at paternity leave and some of the changes of when and how that leave is taken. And then we'll then start moving on to have a look at what may be coming down the track. So we've had 2 changes where we have seen legislation has already been passed, but will require further regulations for them to actually come into effect and for more details. So we don't have all the answers with those, but they are already Acts of Parliament and passed. And then we have 3 other changes which have been promised as part of Labour's Making Work Pay plan, but we don't have any legislation or even draft regulations for those. They are just policy statements, but hopefully will give you an indication of where things are going. So I'll pass over to Hattie now.
Thanks, Rebecca. So our first type of leave that we want to talk to you today about is the new carers leave. So as Rebecca said, this is a new type of leave that has been enforced since the 6th of April this year. So hopefully some of you are already familiar with this. It's a brand new statutory right, and it is a day 1 right. So that means it applies to all employees as soon as they start employment. So it's not dependent on the employee's length of service. So we're going to look by having a look at the key framework that's in play for this new type of leave. As I say, hopefully some of you are already familiar with these. So to start with, this is 1 week's unpaid leave, which employees can take every 12 months. Thanks, Rebecca. And it's there to provide or arrange care for a dependent. And we'll look at what a dependent is in a second. So a week is considered as a length of time the employee usually works over 7 days. So for example, if someone usually works 4 days a week, then they can take 4 days of unpaid carers leave in a 12-month period. So if we look at the meaning of dependent, we're looking at the statutory definition for this. So this includes where they are a spouse, a civil partner, a child, or a parent of an employee, or they live in the same household as the employee. But that's not because they're an employee's boarder, employee, lodger, or tenant, for example. Or it can be someone who's reasonably able to rely on the employee to provide them or arrange care for them. So this could be an elderly neighbour, for example. So the carer's leave is available to those with a dependent, as we just mentioned, who has a long-term care need. So what does long-term care need actually mean? So that would apply where the dependent has an illness or injury, and whether that's physical or mental, that requires or is likely to require care for more than 3 months. It also could be a scenario where the dependent has a disability for the purposes of the Equality Act. And just to refresh that, that's the physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on someone's ability to carry out their normal daily activities. Or it could be because they require care for a reason connected with their old age. And that's really what we've been seeing as it being pitched in the media. So it's likely to be coming up for your employees, perhaps. The leave can be taken in either individual days or half days, or up to a block of 1 week. So there is some flexibility there that we're going to see coming through. And the 1 week's unpaid leave is per employee. So that means that an employee can use the week for different dependents. So for example, they might use half a day to care for their child, provided that dependent meets the criteria for long-term care, which I just discussed. Or they then could use another 2 days for a parent. Again, provided that total leave is taken in a 12-month period and only actually amounts to 1 week. So looking at notice period. So the good news is for employers, the employer will actually need to give notice to the employer if they want to take that carer's leave, but that is still relatively short. That's broken up into 2 categories. So the required notice period is either twice as many days as the leave of period that they require, or 3 days, whichever is the greater. So this could mean that if the request is for half a day, then the notice period must be at least 3 days. And if the request is for more than 1 day, then the notice period must be twice as long as the requested leave. So for example, if it's sort of a simple one here, but if the request is 2 days, the notice period must be at least 4 days. Something to be aware of, which is slightly strange perhaps, and this is that request doesn't need to be in writing, and employees will not need to provide any evidence of their dependents' care needs. So it's important that your managers are aware of this, so that's going to be accounted for when things are coming up in your workplace. Interestingly, the employer can't actually refuse the leave. So this is something organisations, again, need to be live to. But if certain criteria are met, and we'll go through those in a second, the employers can postpone the leave, however. So this is when all of the following apply. So there's 3 things that they would need to do to postpone that leave. The key point here is the employer reasonably considers that the operation of the business would be unduly disrupted. The employer would still need to allow that employee to take the leave requested within a month's period. And to do so, they would need to write to the employee within 7 days of the initial request and set out the reason for postponement and the agreed dates on which the leave can be taken. So there are circumstances that it can be postponed, but as I say, it can't be something that is refused. Just one to think about, when we're looking at carer's leave and dependent leave in this sort of scenario, if an employee is a parent and they are needing to look after a child, they can actually take up to 18 weeks ordinary parental leave to look after the child. So that is another option. It doesn't sit within this unpaid carer's leave, but that is something that's already available that employees may be considering. Employers and your organisations might also be considering, and this is an option you could talk through with them. So it is something else that you might have to be sitting alongside this. Looking at employees' rights, so when they are taking carer's leave, hopefully this is something you're all familiar with, but just to recap, that they do have the right to return to the same job. So even that sort of flexible leave there, and then when they come back to, all of their terms and conditions are remaining the same. So that means that any benefits that they have, even though it's unpaid, are still live to them, and that means that their holiday would still accrue whilst they're on leave. So what does that mean for you? What do you need to be thinking about? So looking at your action points, because there's a new type of leave, the key one here was already updating or even creating a new policy. So it might be that it's a good opportunity as well for you to have some manager training, as I talked about earlier. This is a new type of leave. It's something that hopefully people will be aware of. It's been around in the media quite a bit, but it's also a good opportunity for you to get some refresher training in. So whilst it's an obligation for employees to provide notice, we talked about to employers when there is that intention to take the leave, this is still a relatively short time frame. So it's important managers are live to this and they do know how to respond. And given carer's leave is not something employees can refuse, it's also important to ensure this is understood and the reasons for postponing any leave is well thought through. So that point about unduly disrupting the business is something that will need to be well thought through and good reasons being accompanying to that and explained to the employer appropriately. As this is carers leave, it's a sensitive topic, and then care should be taken when approaching and discussing this. So it's important that managers understand how to have those conversations and their support available with that if needed. Looking at larger organisations, or even sometimes in the smaller organisations you might be working in, it's also important to have good practices in place. So although it doesn't need to be a written request, it could be that you're creating self-certification forms for employees to declare that they meet the criteria when they'll be taking the leave, and ensuring that you have good record-keeping systems. As there is that flexibility, half a day here, perhaps a couple of days later on, it's good for you to be able to note how many days have been taken, what the entitlement is, how can employees access that, perhaps be able to see what they've got available, and managers are aware, so that can be on top of it. It's also something that people might not want to be sharing with their managers so openly, might be something they can be able to check discreetly. So having a think about what processes you have in place and can make that appropriate for your particular workplace. Moving to contractual enhancements. So employers may be looking to consider some contractual enhancements. For example, you might be looking at having paid leave rather than an unpaid leave, something Rebecca will talk about a little bit later on perhaps. And that's something that you might be looking to explore in your organisation. And also, as we talk about it being a good opportunity for refresher training and speaking to your managers and your team, it's also a good opportunity to review the approach that you have for requests to paid leave and unpaid leave in general, ensuring that there's consistency across the board and what you're looking to do to ensure you have good, firm, solid processes in place. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Hattie. Okay, moving on to take a look at enhanced redundancy rights. So first of all, what is the protection we're talking about here? Well, I think it's probably a common misconception, not amongst HR obviously, but in the wider, that women can't be made redundant whilst on maternity leave. Obviously, if there is a genuine redundancy situation, they can be at risk of redundancy, but they do have some added protection in certain situations. So what is that protection? Well, it's the right to be offered a suitable alternative vacancy where one is available in priority over other employees who may be at risk. So if they are at risk of redundancy and there is a suitable alternative vacancy that is available, they have the priority for that vacancy. They shouldn't be put through any kind of interview or selection process. The only exception to that would be if you've got potentially two employees who are both protected in the protected period, and we'll cover what that now looks like. Obviously, then you might need to follow some kind of interview or other appointment process to distinguish between the two of them, but it would only be those who have the protected are in the protected period. Also, it is very clear in the legislation that includes any vacancies with an associated employer, so not just those limited to the limited company that the employee is working in. There is any associated group companies, for example, then you should be looking at vacancies within that organisation as well. So what has been extended? What is the additional? We've seen that since 6th of April this year, now have additional situations where this additional protection, this right to be offered suitable alternative vacancies applies. So the first is for pregnant employees. So now they are also protected from the date that they tell their employer about their pregnancy. And that obviously continues right through to maternity leave. And we've also seen the maternity leave protection. So obviously it was always there when they were actually on maternity leave, now extended to cover a period from when they return from maternity leave. So the protected period will run from 18 months from the date the baby is born. So the length of time that will be protected after the maternity leave will be dependent on how long an employee takes for maternity leave. So everyone will get the same length of protection. It might just be slightly different depending on when and how long they took their maternity leave period. So it's always 18 months from the date the baby is born. It will also apply in adoption leave situations. So those on adoption leave will also be protected. And again, that will be 18 months. The only adjustment is 18 months from the date of placement rather than the date of birth. And also in some situation, people who are on shared parental leave or have taken shared parental leave will also get the protected period, as this will be again 18 months from the date of birth. The only additional condition for shared parental leave is that they need to have taken a continuous 6-week block of leave in order to be qualify. So if they've taken a shorter period or intermittent blocks, then they won't get the additional protection. So it is quite a big extension and will capture quite a few more employees than it has done previously. So what action should you be taking? Well, I think it's important to notify to managers that there is now this additional protection. I mean, let's be honest, they may not have even been aware of the protection originally for those on maternity leave, but we definitely should be flagging to managers that there is now an enhanced period, extended period where they are protected. And if you are planning or unfortunate situation where you have a larger scale redundancy or even just a business reorganisation, you do need to proactively consider this additional protection and think how you're going to deal with it, and probably have a planned approach for dealing with vacancies and how you're going to try and identify those who are within this protected period, identify any suitable alternative vacancies and make sure they are offered to those employees with the protection at the appropriate time. So it is, I think, just a bit more about forward planning because it will capture more people than has been the case previously. Back to you, Hattie.
Thanks, Rebecca. So turning to paternity leave changes, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, there have been some changes here, and the new rules apply in relation to children whose expected week of childbirth is after the 6th of April this year, and children whose expected date of placement for adoption is on or after the 6th of April this year. So that is something that's currently in play at the moment. To look at the changes, I think it's useful to look at where we were previously, so then it's a little bit easier to compare. So looking at what we had beforehand.
Apologies, Hattie.
It's all right. Wait for Rebecca to have our next slide.
It's a bit slow. It's not me. There you go.
Don't worry. There we go. So looking previously, the leave must have been taken within the first 8 weeks, and it must be a block, of that for 1 or 2 weeks. And employers would also need to be giving notice on or before the 15th week before the expected week of childbirth or placement of adoption. So what's changed in April this year? So the key change here is around more choice and flexibility about how and when it's taken. And that's put in place to support families to be able to have that flexibility at home and to be able to make the changes as they need to throughout the year, depending on their circumstances. So there's now an option of 2 separate blocks of 1 week that can be taken anytime in the first year. And this could be a single period of leave of either 1 week or 2 weeks, or 2 non-consecutive periods of leave of each of 1 week each in that first year. So looking at the notice period, the requirement to give notice has been significantly reduced, and that's intended to be proportionate to the amount of time that's been taken off work. So the notice period for each block of leave is now the 28 days. The good news in terms of variation is, again, there is some notice around this. So employees can vary dates if they're going to be taking that at different times. So they can vary the dates that they've been choosing to take that leave, but they will need to give 28 days notice of that variation. So that enables them to change the planned dates at a later stage, again, to suit the needs of their family, but there's still that lead-in time for employers. The key point here is that the eligibility criteria has not changed. So whilst we have had some flexibility around the leave and how that's taken, what the sort of base criteria is in order to meet that for the paternity leave is still remaining the same. So they must still have been continuously employed with their employer for a period of not less than 26 weeks, ending with the week immediately prior to the 14th week before the child's expected week of birth. So looking forward and what might be coming down the line or things to be thinking about, the CIPD's Manifesto for Good Work, something you might have seen talked about recently, which was published last year in September, has actually made some recommendations regarding reviewing statutory paternity leave. The recommendation is that it should be increased to 6 weeks, and that to be paid at full or near to full rate of pay. That's not enforced yet, and unfortunately we don't have a crystal ball or any insight to be able to provide for you here. But looking at the landscape and Labour's plans more generally, we wouldn't be surprised to see some more reform in the paternity leave space. So it is something to be conscious of and live to moving forward. In terms of shared parental leave, we also thought it's useful just to point out that paternity leave must still be taken before shared parental leave, and therefore taking any untaken paternity leave would be lost when starting shared parental leave. So this means that an employee who's planning to take shared parental leave should be using up their paternity leave and pay entitlement first. So it's a good opportunity again to be having conversations around that and making sure that employees are alive to us, and if something that they are looking to take, that they're clear on expectations here. So what does that mean for you in terms of action points and things to be thinking about? Thank you, Rebecca. As there's some changes with your policy, it's a good idea to be updating policies. So perhaps if you're going into detail in your current policies on the leave and notification requirements, it's a good idea to ensure that these are up to date and they're in line with the statutory requirements. Also, if your organisation offers enhancements in your policy, this is a point that they're likely to be reviewed, and we'll talk about that a little bit further on, and making sure, again, that's consistent and you're thinking about what you would like to be doing here. As there are some changes, especially where there's some flexibility about leave being taken at different points, again, it's important to make sure managers are aware, policies are disseminated, and there's a conversation to be able to be had about how those changes are going to impact the team and the business. And also be looking at informing employees with an expected week of childbirth after that 6th of April this year, and ensuring that they're aware of what's going on and any changes that they're able to take advantage of. In terms of contractual entitlements, so it's of course open to employers, as it always has been, to provide enhanced paternity leave and pay. So this could either be in the form of contractual rights, which would usually be built into the individual's contract or alongside their contract of employment, or in a non-contractual paternity leave policy, which is where you do normally see this. So in terms of this particular leave, possible enhancements for leave, what that could look like. So you could be allowing employees to take 2 weeks paternity leave, regardless of the length of service, for example, alongside other things that you may offer, or allowing that 2 weeks to be taken on full pay or at a higher rate of pay than that is of the statutory leave entitlement. Thanks, Rebecca. Over to you.
Hatti. See, I'm quick with my slides.
Yeah, good to
know. So what else are we coming? So we've heard about what is already in effect, what has been in effect since 6th of April. Well, we have seen that, as I mentioned, we've got 2 changes that have already had Acts of Parliament published and approved, but we are waiting for the regulations to implement those, so it's not in force yet. The first one is neonatal leave and pay, and the second one is paternity bereavement leave. So looking first at neonatal leave and pay, so this act is looking to address the situation where you have a child who is still in hospital in neonatal care, to provide some extended leave on top of any other family leave the parent may be entitled to. So the idea being that they won't eat into their maternity leave or shared parental leave, and will be given some additional leave whilst the child is in hospital. The leave element is expected to be capped at 12 weeks, and there is expected to be a pay element, which will be at statutory prescribed rate. Again, we haven't seen the regulations, so we don't know the detail exactly of how this will work or what rights will be in play, but it has been passed in principle, so we are expecting to see draft regulations in respect of this. The second act that we have seen again passed as an act, so the principle agreed, but again we haven't seen any regulations, and they will be needed to put it into effect, is the Paternity Leave Bereavement Act, which was passed in May this year. So this looks to introduce new rights to bereaved fathers and partners where a child mother unfortunately dies. So under the current law, bereaved partners can only take statutory paternity leave if they satisfy minimum service requirements, so the 26 weeks. In addition, obviously, that is only 2 weeks leave that is available. So the Act is looking to address that by, subject to the regulations again, removing the minimum service requirement for bereaved parents for paternity leave. So it will be a day one right for those individuals. And whilst not expressly mentioned in the Act itself, there is a plan to increase the paternity leave for bereaved partners from 2 weeks to 52 weeks. So they will have access to the deceased mother's primary adopters, essentially maternity or shared parental leave. Obviously, hopefully the Act will only apply in a very small number of situations and cases, but it is important for employers to be aware of it. So if that tragic situation does arrive, you'll be aware of what is on offer to the employee. We're likely to see implementation of both of those acts in April next year, so April 2025. So it is a bit of wait and see as to exactly what they'll look like and how they will work. As I mentioned, we've also had 3 other changes which have been promised as part of Labour's Making Work pay plan. The first is in respect of bereavement leave, and they want to review this and look to clarify the leave and extend it to all workers rather than just employees. They're also proposing to make parental leave a day 1 right rather than requiring a year's service as currently. And finally, as Hatti alluded to, they're going to look at the unpaid carers leave and consider introducing a paid element to that, so making it a right to be paid for the carers leave rather than unpaid leave. So what conclusions can we draw from all of that? Well, I think it's fair to say there is a complex network of statutory leave rights that continues to expand. And I don't think we're going to see any simplification from that under the new government's proposals. As I just mentioned, there are more proposals being looked at. And if anything, I think we're likely to see more types of leave and more pay requirements. So this may be a good opportunity to review your policies, review your processes, and consider some your contractual enhanced entitlements may be. It's an opportunity to potentially make them more consistent and look at potentially whether that can aid equality goals as well. So it is just one of those things that is very complicated, but potentially something that you could look at to try and simplify with enhanced rights. So I'm just conscious of time, but you'll appreciate we've been focusing on anticipating the employment, the changes in terms of parental leave, but we are expecting the Employment Rights Bill, which will obviously have much more far-reaching potential changes coming up. So we're hoping to see that published prior to our next update on the 24th of October. And if that is the case, which we all hope will be, the focus of that webinar will be that bill and the proposals within that. So please do sign up to that if you haven't yet done so. So now let's just have a look at questions. So we have had a few. I'll just kick it off, Hattie, if you just have a read through as well. But there's some questions on there arising from how you implement the extended redundancy protection and the differences between selection, pooling, and essentially reappointment criteria. I think what I would say is that's a very complicated area, fraught with risk in terms of sex discrimination from men as well as women. So it isn't something that I'm going to be able to answer here and there, but it is something you do need to think through very carefully. And there was also a question around the implications of if you've got someone who's, for example, going through looking at redeployment because they're off on long-term sick or something like that. So the interesting part about the redundancy protection for maternity leave is that it is a very one of the only set out clear positive discrimination action. So you should be treating that as first priority, that is in statute, that is clear. Obviously, you also have to do what you can with those with disabilities and long-term sick, but the maternity leave extended protection period does take priority. Hattie, was there any that...
There are a couple on some specific cared leave scenarios, but I think they're ones that we would need to follow up with you afterwards, so we won't be able to answer in the time we have available, conscious of our time, but there are a couple that we might be able to follow up with you on.
Everyone's asking very difficult questions. Are there any plans for enhancement of statutory maternity leave and pay? None that we have heard so far. So I think, that the maternity leave and pay will stand as is currently. As I say, we will be looking at everything that's coming in terms of the Employment Rights Bill in our next update. And that's when we'll finally get an indication of exactly what the new proposals will be. So there's also a question around 0 hours and take advantage of the new leave periods. That does come down to eligibility and looking at whether they're workers or employees. As I indicated, one of the proposals is that Labour is making is to expand eligibility not just to employees but also to workers, and it varies depending on the type of leave taken. But it may be that we do get further developments in that to expand it to include workers rather than just employees.
And there's one more I can see just come through about carers leave. So how many days you can be taken with the new carers leave. So that is up to 1 week within a 12-month period, and that's for every employee. So it means that, so talking about that scenario about breaking it up, they have that 1 week within that 12-month period that they can take that. So as it can be split up, it needs to amount to 1 week.
And then there's just an anonymous one. I'm trying to pick them up because we won't go back, obviously, but EWC stands for expected week of childbirth. So it's the point where it's measured against just a set point of how that you can then use the others flowing from and to that. Okay, I think we've managed to grab most of the anonymous ones. So the others we will be able to follow up with if we haven't answered any following after your questions or in answering some of the others. But hopefully you've all got the benefit of that. And like I say, do sign up to the 24th of October one if you are free, because we are anticipating a lot more changes down the line.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Rebecca.